Hi, welcome to At the Movies with AMC. My name's Jon Spurney, and we're talking about the classic age of Hollywood cinema, uh, pretty much from the invention of sound in 1927 to the development of the Hollywood rating system in 1968. Today, our topic is the Hollywood star system. And so, of course, we will be talking about movie stars. And to my mind, there's probably no greater movie star of Hollywood's golden age than Cary Grant. Um, Grant, of course, was one of the most debonair leading men in Hollywood movies for really over 30 years. And in almost all of his roles, he epitomizes a certain sort of erudite sophistication. He's suave, debonair, he's well-dressed, well-spoken. He always uses the classic mid-Atlantic accent that so many actors affected during the classic Hollywood era. It's this kind of weird mix of an American accent and an English accent that you really only find in movies of that period. But when Cary Grant was born in Bristol, England, his name was actually Archibald Leach. And before he began acting in films, he was an acrobat in a traveling vaudeville company. So Archibald Leach, traveling British acrobat, became Cary Grant, debonair American leading man, thanks to the Hollywood star system. So when we talk about the star system, we're talking about the ways in which Hollywood studios used the heightened personalities of their contracted actors in order to popularize the films in which those actors were appearing. Excuse me. And it's important to stress that that these weren't necessarily the actual personalities of the performers in question, but rather personas that were often created out of whole cloth by the studios in order to glamorize and exploit the attractive people that were appearing on screen in their films. And often, as we will see, unfortunately, the disparity between the personas the studios created and the actual personalities of the performers in question had negative effects on the lives of the stars themselves. At its peak during the golden age of Hollywood, the star system was an almost industrial process that just created personalities, it like a factory. It created and exploited the personas of performers in order to increase their personal popularity and, of course, the popularity of the films in which they appeared. But the star system would provide the basis of Hollywood popularity only until the 1970s, when the so-called New Hollywood came into vogue. And today, the star system is essentially non-existent. So how did the Hollywood star system begin and develop? During the early years of the silent era, performers in films were not identified. The filmmakers thought of the actors in their productions as disposable. They didn't want any of them to achieve enough popularity that they would demand more money, higher salaries for their work in films. And Thomas Edison, who of course invented the modern movie camera and projector, his motion picture patents company, which controlled the manufacture and distribution of film equipment, all film equipment, at this time during the early silent era, they discouraged the promotion of individual performers for this very reason. They didn't want to have to pay actors more money. And oddly enough, the actors themselves, many of whom had begun their careers in the theater, thought of cinema acting as a lower form of work. And they did not necessarily want people to even know about their participation in it. Being in a movie was slumming for an actor at this time. And you have to remember that at this time, films were silent. And for many actors who had come out of the theater, the use of their voice was the primary skill an actor needed to develop. So the fact that their voices weren't heard made the roles seem less important to them. But despite this lack of identification, moviegoers themselves began to recognize certain performers that appeared in multiple films. And at the same time, fan magazines, such as this one, Motion Picture Story magazine, began to appear. And these magazines needed to be able to identify certain performers in films in order to report on them. Because actors weren't credited, movie fans began to make up names for their favorite performers because they saw them in so many movies. And this led to the woman some consider to be the first real Hollywood movie star. And that is an actress named Florence Lawrence. Obviously not her real name. Lawrence made over 60 movies in 1908 alone. Just in that 1 year, she made 60 pictures. And they were all for Biograph, working with director D.W. Griffith, who would, of course, go on to become one of the greatest directors of the silent era, making films that are now considered classics like Birth of a Nation or Intolerance. Fans would write letters to the studio asking for her name, but the studio would refuse to give her name out. And so as a result, she became known to moviegoers everywhere simply as the Biograph Girl, because that was the studio she made all of her films for. Carl Laemmle, who would later found Universal Pictures, noticed the attraction that the Biograph Girl had for all these fans. And so he hired Florence Lawrence for his independent moving pictures company. And he began, for the first time, crediting her by name, making her one of the first actors in movie history ever to receive on-screen billing. And he saw that she was so popular, he even went so far as to spread a rumor that she had been killed in a streetcar accident in order to increase people's interest in her. And other studios saw the success of this and they followed suit, which would lead to the release of a lot of fake news stories about their performers in order to build up interest and loyalty to the studio's pictures. And of course, these sort of fake news stories would become a fundamental part of the star system in the classic Hollywood era, the sound era. So how did this star system work at that time, during the peak of Hollywood, during the sound era? Actors were selected by the studio. They were signed to a long-term contract, and then a process of recreation began. And this process often began simply with the selection of a glamorous name. So we saw how Archibald Leach, which is not a very sexy name, became Cary Grant. Similarly, there are tons of examples, but a prop boy named Marion Morrison became the Western hero John Wayne. And Isser Danielovich, who was the impoverished son of a ragman from Russia, from the Russian Empire, became Kirk Douglas. And a factory worker named Norma Jean Mortensen became the ultimate blonde bombshell, Marilyn Monroe. So the name was always a fundamental part of the process. It's very rare that a star of the Hollywood era kept their original name. And the studios would provide their stars with wardrobe, which they would not only wear on screen, but they would use in their personal lives off screen. As you know, stars were never to be seen in public without the glamorous appearance people expected of them, the glamorous appearance that people saw when they saw them on screen. The actors were given dance, voice, acting lessons. But it is important to remember that the emphasis, and we're going to be talking about this a little later, the emphasis of movie stardom was on image rather than acting. Whether you could act was less important than whether you could present a persona that was popular with a lot of people and that could be grafted over lots of stories. I mean, obviously, a performer had to be a suitably good actor or actress in order to make it as a movie star. And this, I think, is a very important point that many people miss when talking about classic Hollywood movie stars. The source of their popularity was not so much their acting ability as it was having this marketable persona that could work in a variety of roles. So, as an example, when we talk about a movie star like Humphrey Bogart, we are talking about a specific, cynical, world-weary persona, the one that he portrays in multiple roles, rather than the actual personality of a guy named Humphrey Bogart. That, by the way, was his real name. Or his particular acting ability in any one role itself. So if you watch a lot of Bogart pictures, you know, the cynical, world-weary casino owner, Nick, from Casablanca in 1941 is the same as the cynical, world-weary tank commander in Sahara from 1943, or the cynical, world-weary boat captain from The African Queen in 1951. You know, these are all vastly different stories that take place in different times and places. But the character played by Humphrey Bogart is the same guy. It's Humphrey Bogart. And people loved that, and that is what makes movie stars, you know, made people go see pictures with stars that they loved. You know, what unites these pictures and our enjoyment of them is Humphrey Bogart's portrayal of a certain kind of personality, a personality that came to be known as Humphrey Bogart, rather than the specifics of each role itself. And this, I think, is true of all of the performances of classic Hollywood movie stars. Another good example is Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart is always a decent, everyman, next door type, whether he is an idealistic sheriff in the Old West in the 1870s in Destry Rides Again, or an idealistic freshman senator in then modern Washington, D.C. in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Both of those pictures were made in the same year, 1939. And, you know, one is a Western, one is a modern picture, but, you know, Stewart is essentially playing the same character, and that is Jimmy Stewart. So, you know, this is not to say that movie stars like Bogart and Stewart could not act, but their real talent and popularity came from embodying a specific, repeatable, and attractive personality type that could be placed in a variety of situations and stories. And just to make the distinction a little clearer, for example, Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep is the greatest actress of her generation, but I would never call her a movie star. You know, she is not a movie star because we watch Meryl Streep films to see her transform herself into another human being, not to revel in some sort of Meryl Streep personality that she embodies in movie after movie after movie. She's different in every movie, and that is the source of her popularity. But that is not movie stardom. You know, movie stardom is kind of playing the same thing in every movie. You know, Harrison Ford is the same in every movie. There's no difference, you know, between Han Solo and Indiana Jones. They are the same character, and that character is Harrison Ford, you know, and that is being a movie star. And, you know, in many ways, I feel that ability, the ability to embody a persona that can be placed in multiple narratives, is kind of a rarer and more valuable skill than just the skill of acting itself. And it is certainly that skill, rather than mere acting ability, that epitomizes the star system of the classic Hollywood era. So obviously these personae, you know, were incredibly valuable commodities. They could get people into theaters. And so studios had entire staffs whose only job was to cover up lifestyles or personal incidents that might harm the public's perception of a movie star's marketable persona, or, you know, go against that persona, because of course that's not what any of those actors were like in real life. So for example, in the 50s, a handsome leading man like Rock Hudson, whose real name was Roy Scherer, he would be set up by studio fixers to go on fake dates with young starlets from the studio in order to hide the real truth behind his personal life. And these machinations were done by guys they called fixers. One of the most famous of these fixers was a guy named Eddie Mannix. I mean, look at that picture, who would help cover up the personal lives of stars. And Mannix did it at MGM for almost 40 years. And he was so sort of infamous and well-known. He's very well-known to movie buffs, that he was actually portrayed by Josh Brolin in the 2016 Coen Brothers movie, Hail Caesar, which I highly recommend if you like old movies. It's like a pastiche of old movies, and Brolin plays Mannix and, you know, has his hands full covering up the private lives of the people who are starring in the various movies. But these attempts to control the image of stars could have negative effects on the mental health of the real people behind these fake personae. A good example of the way studios would affect the personal lives of stars is the story of the actress Loretta Young, who was a really popular star of the 40s and 50s. When she was just starting in her career, she made a picture called The Call of the Wild in 1935. And she had an affair with her co-star, pictured here, Clark Gable, who was one of the biggest stars of the 1930s. You might know him from Gone with the Wind. He plays Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. So Loretta Young had an affair with Gable, and she became pregnant. But Gable was married to another woman at the time. And Loretta Young was only 22 years old and unmarried as well. So Loretta Young went to England in order to hide her pregnancy, and she gave birth to the baby in secret. And then, per the studio, that baby was then sent to an orphanage and lived there for 19 months so that people would think the baby was an orphan. And then Loretta Young was allowed to adopt, you know, a fake adoption of her actual biological daughter. And even after that fact, you know, the studio and was terrified that people would recognize that Loretta Young's daughter was Clark Gable's child, because Clark Gable famously had really big ears that stood out. And that was true of the child he had with Loretta Young. And so the studio had her daughter's ears surgically altered when she was just 7 years old, so that they would not stick out like Clark Gable's ears, and so that people could not see a physical resemblance. That's a pretty infamous Hollywood story, but it literally didn't come out until Loretta Young was like 80 years old. And I think her daughter, it might have even been that her daughter wrote it in her autobiography and waited until Loretta Young was dead to tell the true story. And other Hollywood stars were trapped inhabiting a persona, you know, that was completely different than who they actually were or how they wanted other people to see them, you know, or how they saw themselves. In previous talks, we've discussed how Olivia de Havilland, her desire to play different roles than those her studio chose for her, ultimately led to legal action. She sued the studio. And as a result of that lawsuit, we got the Paramount Consent Decree of 1948, which helped end the studio era itself. But perhaps I think no iconic Hollywood star more embodied the disconnect between image and reality than Marilyn Monroe. Monroe was always portrayed as the proverbial dumb blonde, an intelligent woman who was sexually irresistible to intelligent men. But when she wanted to play more substantive roles later in her career, she wasn't taken seriously. And this exacerbated the psychological and substance abuse problems that she already suffered from. And ultimately, she committed suicide in 1962 when she was just 36 years old. It's a really tragic story. She was an incredibly talented person, and the way Hollywood tried to force her into a box that she was not happy to be in, made her very, very unhappy, and she had an ultimately tragic life. So, what brought about the end of the star system? A fundamental reason the star system ended was that it was an integral part of the studio system. And we've talked previously about the studio system and how that ended. So with the demise of the studio system in the 1950s and 1960s, the star system disappeared along with it. In addition, starting in the late 1950s, a very different new style of acting known as the method began to gain ground in Hollywood. It sort of started in America more theatrically in New York in sort of Broadway plays, but it moved to the West Coast as those Broadway actors started participating in movies. And the method is actually Russian. It was based on a system developed by the Russian theater actor Konstantin Stanislavski. Stanislavski felt that actors should experience feelings analogous to those being experienced by their characters every time they played a role in order to more fully inhabit the character. And this much more realistic style of acting, which is embodied by 50s actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean, went against everything we're talking about, the previously discussed marketable personae that were typical of movie stardom in Hollywood's golden age. These guys inhabited roles the way Meryl Streep does. And so by the 1990s, the last of the marketable movie personae really came of age in performers like Harrison Ford and Tom Hanks or Will Smith. These are kind of the last guys who have a marketable persona that stays the same from movie to movie. So now in Hollywood, it's not stars, it is the franchise. Like Marvel movies or the Fast and Furious, it's the franchise that is the repeated formula that can be marketed in order to get people to see a movie, to get them into the theater, rather than the personalities of the performers within that movie themselves. And so I think Hollywood likes this because the stars in these franchises can be easily swapped out as long as the character in the franchise and the franchise itself stays the same. So that's why you have now multiple actors playing Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, because it's the franchise that matters, not the actor. The franchise continues no matter what actor appears in the title role or indeed any role. And so the marketable persona of an individual has been taken over by the marketable plot and story elements of the franchise. And that is why the star system no longer exists. So our next and final session, I've really enjoyed this, and I hope you'll check out our last talk on 21 October at 2000 hours MST. We'll be discussing the rise of the auteur. The studio system was mostly centered on faceless collaboration behind the camera. But with the demise of the golden age of Hollywood, certain American directors rose to become lauded as individual artists whose distinctive styles permeate their varied oeuvre. So we'll look at directors like Frank Capra, John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock, Billy Wilder, Orson Welles, all the good ones, and how they managed to remain creatively independent within the creative confines of the studio system. So that will be on 21 October. I hope you guys can join me then. And if anybody has any questions, I would love to answer your questions. So someone asks, at the time, did the public know about the star system? No. I mean, the whole point of the system is, I don't want to say to fool people, but, we talked about how people's private lives were covered up, fake news stories were sent out. I'm sure media savvy people knew that there were machinations behind the scenes in order to protect movie stars and their popularity. But I think the whole point of the system is that there are these amazing people in Hollywood, and we get a rare glimpse into their glamorous lives. And I think the vast majority of people didn't know that those glamorous lives were being controlled and dictated by the studios. I know that people know that they enjoyed the persona of Jimmy Stewart and went to see movies because, it was a Jimmy Stewart picture. And so they could expect Jimmy Stewart's character to be a certain way. Or, they knew that Marilyn Monroe was a beautiful woman. And, if you went to see a Marilyn Monroe movie, she was going to be attractive and beautiful. That's a big part of it. But I don't think people knew everything that was going on behind the scenes to create that situation. And I find even now, when I give people, my hot take on Meryl Streep is not a movie star, that upsets a lot of people. Like, I think a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that idea that a movie star, it's not their acting you're going to see, it's their persona. But I think if you watch a lot of movies, that's incredibly obvious. Someone asks, were any of these stars resistant to the role or public personas the studios crafted for them? Yeah, I think a lot were. Famously, Olivia de Havilland, as we said, she sued the studio because they wanted her to play roles she wasn't interested in. She sued and won. Before her, Bette Davis famously sued Warner Brothers kind of for the same reason. She sued and lost. But I think it was pretty typical. I mean, just think about if you're a creative person and, this company is telling you what parts you can play and what clothes you have to wear and who you can go to dinner with. And, all of these people obviously were very well paid and lived very easy material lives. But I think it must have been difficult for all of them, even, the most successful ones, to have their lives controlled as much as they were at that time. Another question. How did Hollywood's star system influence film industries in other countries? I think, like so many aspects of Hollywood films, the Hollywood film industry was sort of the first great world entertainment. It was kind of the first entertainment that was broadcast all over the world. I mean, going as far back as Charlie Chaplin. You know, Charlie Chaplin was the most famous man in the world in almost every country in the world. So I think, you know, Hollywood created the idea of stardom. You know, there were obviously opera stars and theater stars. There were people who were famous in the creative fields before the invention of motion pictures. But motion pictures enables the transmission of somebody's work throughout the world, and in a very controlled way. And that is kind of the basis of movie stardom. And that creates what we're talking about today, the marketing of a specific persona that has the name of you know, John Wayne is John Wayne. And you go to a picture not to see John Wayne be different. You go to a picture to see John Wayne be John Wayne, you know, and that is, you can't do that unless you have an art form that is, you know, physically recreatable and transmissible. And, you know, that's what movies are. Are there modern equivalents of these Hollywood icons, or has celebrity culture changed too much for that comparison? I think it's really almost non-existent. You know, I think people who work in Hollywood will say Will Smith was really the last movie star, in that he was the last guy that they knew if his name was on the poster, people would go see the movie. You know, when I think about movie stars now, somebody that I think could be a movie star is Glenn Powell. I don't know if you've seen any movies with Glenn Powell, but you know, I've seen maybe 4 or 5 pictures he's been in, which have all been very popular in the United States. And he's definitely developed a persona that he is cleverly fitting into movies in a variety of genres. But, you know, they're very few and far between. And I also think, you know, just people's attention spans are so minuscule now, you know, with TikTok and social media, people want novelty. And it's always like, what's the new thing this week? You know, what's the meme this week? You know, there's always going to be famous people. But the notion of that persona that you can stretch across multiple works is, I think, gone. And also, you know, the whole notion of controlling somebody's image, when social media enables every performer to completely control their own image and how the public sees them, that creates a lot of problems for the studios. You know, most infamously this year, Rachel Zegler, you know, played Snow White in a remake that Disney made, a live action remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And on her Instagram page, you know, she would make very provocative political statements about things that she sincerely believed, but things that were not conducive to marketing a movie, you know, a fairy tale for children. And that's the sort of thing that never would have happened in a million trillion years during the classic studio era, because the studios wouldn't allow actors to say anything political or provocative, you know, to do anything that wasn't part of their persona. Sorry. I feel like there are a lot of famous actors who generally play the same or similar characters across different movies, almost as if they are just being themselves. Do you disagree? I do not disagree. That's sort of what the point of this whole talk is, that is what being a movie star is. You know, and I would disagree with the contention that they are playing themselves, but they are playing the same personality across multiple roles, and that is being a movie star. I mean, I'll tell you, you know, I live in Los Angeles. I have a lot of friends in the movie business. I have a friend who's a really great director who made a movie with Harrison Ford. And when he first, Harrison Ford said he would make the movie, they sat down to look at the script. And the first thing Harrison Ford said to my friend is, this character's great, but we need to change this a little bit so that he's a little more Harrison Fordy, a little more like Harrison Ford. This is Harrison Ford saying this, and what he means is if you go see Harrison Ford in a movie, you expect him to be a certain way. And as written, this character was not that way. So the script was changed so that, the story was the same, but that character behaved more like Han Solo or Indiana Jones, because that is what we expect when we see a movie with Harrison Ford. And that is being a movie star. And I love that story because it shows that Harrison Ford understands that. He knows that, he is playing a character named Harrison Ford that is playing a character in every movie Harrison Ford is in. And it's a sophisticated thing, but that is being a movie star. You are playing a character that is yourself, or of some version of yourself. Someone asks which modern actors are best at that, and I said Glenn Powell, I think, is somebody who strikes me lately. I think it's more fashionable for actors, to stretch out and prove that they have acting chops, and that they're an actor. They're not just a personality. Leonardo DiCaprio is an incredibly popular actor, but I wouldn't call him a movie star because he, takes on different roles and different characters, and he's acting, he's doing the Meryl Streep thing. But on the other side of that, I would say George Clooney is a movie star. Like, George Clooney is always George Clooney. And it's interesting because I think George Clooney's persona is very similar to Cary Grant's persona. It's that suave, debonair guy. And, I have no doubt, George Clooney seems like a very intelligent actor. And I have no doubt that he's completely aware of the fact that, like what I said about Harrison Ford, he is playing George Clooney, playing whatever role George Clooney is playing. Sorry, it gets complicated, but this whole thing is a self-awareness about your persona and fitting that persona into the actual role in the movie. And that, to me, is movie stardom. We're almost out of time. I'm going to take one more. Did the actors know in advance what kind of stars they would be made into, what kind of personae they needed to present to the audience, or did they simply sign a contract and then have no say in the matter? That's a good question. I think a lot of times bit players would get signed to contracts because they made an impression. They would have a small role in a picture and people would remember them. They would stick out for whatever reason. Sometimes just because they were beautiful, particularly attractive men or women. And that would make them interesting to the studio. But sometimes the thing that made them stick out is the thing the studio would say, oh, we can turn this into a marketable persona. But the interesting thing is, over people's careers, it could change. So famously, if you watch early Humphrey Bogart movies, he's always a villain. He's always a bad guy. Kirk Douglas as well. Their early films, they were always cast as bad guys. And then, something changed and they stood out in some way. And the studio suddenly said, oh, these guys could be leading men, and you can see if you watch a lot of their movies when it happens, and it's very obvious that the studio makes the decision. It's like, you are now a good guy, with Humphrey Bogart. It's incredibly obvious because all of his early movies, And it makes sense. I mean, Humphrey Bogart is kind of a, he's a tough guy. And so initially he was only cast as a villain. And then he made a movie called The Petrified Forest, I want to say in 1935. And that's kind of when they saw that he could be a tough leading man, and his career totally changed. Do you think Adam Sandler is a movie star and comedy actors in general? I wouldn't say comedy actors in general, but I would say Adam Sandler. Adam Sandler has a really recognizable, silly persona, and like Tommy Boy or Happy Gilmore, he's playing kind of the same guy. And he's an interesting example because, he made a really good movie called The Wedding Singer, which is his silly persona, but it's sort of tamped down a little bit and put into a romantic comedy. And so it's changed from Adam Sandler is this kind of silly, daffy guy to Adam Sandler is a sensitive guy who occasionally can act silly to make his girlfriend laugh, and it totally works. Like it's sort of the best, like that to my mind is Adam Sandler's best movie. He's also, Adam Sandler really interestingly is in a Paul Thomas Anderson movie called Punch Drunk Love, which is really not a comedy at all. It's a very weird, idiosyncratic P.T. Anderson movie. But there's still something, and it was definitely, a stretch. I think Adam Sandler's trying to stretch a little bit, like, what's that movie? Precious Jewels or something. He made a movie with the Safdie brothers a couple years ago where he plays a jeweler, and that it's not a comedy at all. So I think maybe he's trying, and this is something modern actors do, like they establish the persona and then they rebel against the persona consciously to prove to people that they can actually act. So Adam Sandler has done that and is doing that, but I would say Adam Sandler is definitely a movie star. But not all comedians are, I think, but he is a good example. Older examples, somebody like Chevy Chase is a comedy star, but he's the same in every movie. He's Chevy Chase, even Steve Martin in his early career. I think a lot of the reason for that is that a lot of guys, comedy people who get into movies start out as stand-up. And, in order to do stand-up, you have to develop a persona, a you in quotes that inhabits the material you're doing as a comedian. And so that persona can be transferred into movies. And I think that's been, the entrance for a lot of, all the people from, there's a very popular comedy program in America called Saturday Night Live. And many, many performers from that show have moved into movies. But basically just inhabiting the personality that they established on the TV show, and then, putting that personality into different movie stories. And that is movie stardom. That is the difference between being a movie star and an actor. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your great questions as always. And like I said, we'll be back next time to talk about the auteur theory, and that will be our last discussion. So I hope to see you then. Thanks so much.